everybody. I'm Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust, and I'm really excited to be at the Greensboro History Museum here in Greensboro, North Carolina. We're joined today by John Zachman, who's one of the curators at the museum, and we're seeing the Dr. John and Isabella Murphy Confederate Long Arms Collection, which is a fantastic collection of artifacts that's housed here at the Greensboro History Museum. We encourage you to come out here to see all kinds of facets of Greensboro's history. The museum itself is fabulous, and John can talk a little bit more about that, but you can also head over to their website and see when the museum's open and see what they have on display. But John, before we really dive into all of the awesome artifacts you've pulled out for us, can you tell us a little bit about Dr. Murphy and his wife?
Absolutely. So, well, first of all, thanks, Chris, for coming to visit us and taking interest in our collection here. I know that a lot of folks know about the collection and are excited about it, as we are. So Dr. Murphy was a psychiatrist and followed in the footsteps of his father, actually, but grew up in Virginia and heard stories about his Confederate ancestors, sparked an interest in collecting, and then in his adulthood really assembled this remarkable collection of Confederate long arms and some 150 or so weapons. He was very active in the Sons of Confederate Veterans and other related organizations. He was also very active in the American Society of Arms Collectors, and he also was, was a scholar in many ways. He wrote articles and then eventually published 2 books that are really a significant part of his legacy in terms of the research that he and Howard Mattis did on Confederate long arms, rifles, muskets, and musketoons.
Yeah, it's amazing. You've pulled out some things here, and we can see John and Isabel here. We can see him actually sitting in his study with part of the collection right behind him. He's reading one of the gun reports, and then you can also see 2 of the gun reports he wrote for, as well as 2 of his books. So it's interesting that you said he's not just a collector; he's a scholar. And I think a lot of people forget that the collectors actually, in many ways, are scholars. Even if they haven't written for a scholarly journal, haven't written a book themselves, they do a lot of research into these arms. And what's great about them, we get a lot of lineage with them. We might know who carried these weapons. We might know who manufactured them, meaning all the way down to the person themselves. And you have some great stories you've already been sharing with us. So let's take a look at a few of the long arms you've pulled out for us. What are we looking at right in front of you?
So right in front of me are 3 examples of Fayetteville Armory rifles. And as you said, Dr. Murphy was a very discerning collector. He only collected pieces that were pristine condition, that were complete more or less, not damaged, no replacement parts, nothing of that nature. And also the provenance was important to him as well, making sure they were well documented. So one of the strengths of his collection, besides those sort of criteria, was that he also collected multiple examples of pieces made over time. And so the difference between these rifles, so we know Fayetteville Armory, a lot of the machinery that was at Harper's Ferry came down, right? And then was used at Fayetteville to manufacture, between 8,000 and 10,000 rifles for Confederate soldiers in the Carolinas and elsewhere. So this first piece is an earlier one, and it's a so-called Type 1. And I'm not going to get too much into all the technical details, but part of this typology of weapons is based on the changes that have occurred over time, especially with regard to this high hump. If you look at the lock mechanism and the lock plate, you can see there are very distinct differences between what's here considered a Type 1, this is considered a Type 2, and this is considered, has elements of Type 2 and 3. And so that kind of comparative study is really what a lot of the researchers and scholars get into, really digging down into the minutia of the number of markings or the different numbers of screws or locations of the various pieces and bands, etc. So those are, so this is, like I said, so these are 3 examples, and then we have some later ones, meaning some Type 4s that were made later in 1863 and 1864 that are on exhibit right now. But so that's just one example where you can see multiple pieces made by the same or at the same location.
So Fayetteville is an armory that'll be producing Confederate arms all the way up through the late war. It's finally captured March 12th of 1865 by the first Michigan engineers who actually destroy Fayetteville. But as John said, this is a lot of equipment brought down from Harper's Ferry, which was an arsenal in Virginia at the time, today West Virginia. And this is what's going to help to produce some of these Confederate arms. A lot of folks think that the Confederacy only purchased arms from abroad or stole from what they could from battlefields or from Yankee depots. But they have a great collection here in Greensboro showing us that they've actually produced them. Now, what's interesting about these rifles that you've chosen, most people who see a Civil War musket or a rifle, they usually have 3 bands. Notice I don't have gloves on, but I'm not touching them, so everyone always comments about that. We have the 2 different bands. They're made out of brass, a lot of brass on these guns. We also have, for the bayonet lock, these would be able to have a saber bayonet on the end of these things because they have the side attachment for it rather than going around the sight for those socket bayonets. The socket bayonet goes over the end of the gun and then locks into place. That allows you to still fire your musket. This might seem a little bit silly, but before this we had plug bayonets where you would legitimately just plug a bayonet into the end of the gun and you couldn't fire anymore. Then it turns it into a long pike or a spear. Yeah. We also have the elevated sights, it looks like. So we have the range on this, and then we have some beautiful stocks. Can you tell us the difference between the Type 1 stock and the Type 2 stock? I see that we have this little brass compartment back there. What's that for?
Oh, you're talking about the patch box here?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so these earlier pieces have this patch box, which was fairly common and used to store, patches, other things that would be used in terms of ignition for getting the weapon to expel the ammunition. And so we've gradually kind of moved away from that between the Type 1 and 2. Also, on this one, you can see Fayetteville, if you're lucky. Some of these details are worn and not as easily seen, and I think that's about all you can make out on the plate here. As we get into the later pieces, you can actually see the date. So here we see 1862. We also see Fayetteville, and then we see this eagle over, I think it's over CSA. That's right, yeah.
A couple other questions. Number one, is this an original strap for it that we have here?
It's hard to say if it's original to this weapon. Like I said earlier, I think Dr. Murphy was especially keen on purchasing things that were intact and didn't have replacement or other. So I'm fairly confident that it's period. I'm reasonably confident that it's original to this piece, but I can't be 100% certain about that. That kind of information is not recorded in his notes for that level of detail for some of these pieces. Similarly with some of the ramrods and some of the other accessories that were removable. But I'm because of his sort of strict criteria and discipline in collecting, I'm pretty certain that he wouldn't have taken things, or he would have gotten rid of it if it wasn't appropriate or wasn't original to the piece itself.
And I'm thinking sling. I couldn't come up with the term at the time. Sling.
Oh, yeah.
They,
some of them you'll see, a lot of them are missing obviously because they're so fragile and just through use and whatever they don't survive. But we do have examples that do have the slings and many that don't.
Just sit one up for us.
Yeah, I get a sense of the height of it.
Yeah. So the great thing about this weapon, this is considered a long arm. Absolutely, it's very similar to what we would consider a Mississippi rifle would have that look. So we have the brass on the outside. A lot of the Springfields that you would see carried by the Union would not be using brass this time. The Enfields would be using those. We have a brass trigger guard, but very similar style because they are using Union machinery or United States machinery that they've captured, brought down to here. Percussion weapons, early war, sometimes you would see flintlocks still being carried by the Confederates. So this is a great representation of some of the very limited industrial capacity that the Confederacy has, so they're actually down here producing these arms. We'll take a look at a few other items that we have here at the Greensboro History Museum. We switched out what we are looking at now, and we have a new batch of small arms that we can explore and examine, and it's an amazing juxtaposition. If you've seen what was produced at Fayetteville, we're going to move across the Southern Confederacy, across the Deep South, and we're going to take a look at some weapons produced in New Orleans. Is that correct?
New Orleans and later Athens, Georgia.
Athens, Georgia, and New Orleans. So, John, what do we have here? And I think I made the comment, this looks like a hot mess of a gun. So
I think you didn't make that comment. What we have here are examples of Cook and Brother. I think it was Francis and Ferdinand Cook who came together and started weapons manufacturing first in New Orleans area, and that was in the 1861, 1862 time period. And then of course they had to flee with the fall of New Orleans, and managed to shuffle, I guess, most of their equipment to the Athens, Georgia area, and then resume production the last 2 years of the war. So these are in chronological order, starting with this first one here, and this would be an 1861 example. I believe, yeah, it says Cook and Brothers, or Cook and Brother, excuse me. Maybe it says New Orleans, or maybe it just says NO, I'm not sure. NO, okay, and then just the date, 1861. And so you can see this is got its two bands as well. It's missing the sling. Again, it's got a patch box, as the pieces that we earlier looked at. Oh, and it's also got this flag. I forgot to mention the flag here outside of the lock.
So what's interesting about this piece, and as we'll make our way up through here, and I was just joking calling it a hot mess, it's actually really cool because what we're seeing is the evolution of the Confederacy, or the de-evolution of the Confederacy, as they're hodgepodging and patching together what they can to make their manufacture of arms. So, looking at this first piece here, we see an elevated sight, which is reminiscent of an Enfield. Mm-hmm. We see over here, where the cone is of the gun, we don't see a side screw. Now, that's a side screw is indicative of an 1861 Springfield, where you can take the screw out of the side. It's actually easier to clean. 63 Springfields, which are a lighter rifle, will actually have that smoothed into there. So it's kind of interesting to see what you have here. If you move your way up the gun here, Gary, you'll notice we still have the brass. We have the brass and pendimentia on it, but not using the right words right now. But we have the stamped on the side. Socket where you can put the socket bayonet. This will be the attachment for it. But if you look at the sight, it's a very, very rudimentary sight on the end. But when it stands out, it's actually going to be a different color. So this will be easier to fire down range. And so this will be able to make this out when you see the elevated sight back here, look down range, and it'll be a little bit easier if you're actually firing on a target. So that's an interesting piece here. As we move our way up the guns, you'll see the evolution, or as I said, de-evolution of these sights. They become more rudimentary, especially the rear sight on these guns. We'll still see the very similar sight at the end of the gun, but we have this rudimentary one here. John, this is an 1862. Are we still in New Orleans?
Yeah, we're still in New Orleans, and I think the lock plate's similar in its markings with the flag, and then the Cook and Brother NO and the year, and then maybe a serial number as well.
And the other interesting point as we look here, when John picks up the next one, the hammer is going to start to change. We have 3 different almost style hammers on these guns. And you do have hammer molds whenever you're making these different hammers, but they all look just a little bit different. The sights will remain the same, at least the rear sights on the 62 and 63. But that's interesting. It seems down here where the bayonet attachment is, it seems like they just came up with anything that they could. This is actually screwed on. I've never seen this in person, where they've actually screwed that onto the end where you can attach your bayonet.
So it's removable instead of welded on there.
Yeah, that's really neat.
Yeah.
You couldn't use the sights for the socket bayonet for sure.
And I think this is also, I don't know if you saw the detail of this. I think it's also at this part of the barrel here. It's also marked. Can you make that out?
Oh yeah, very well. Now it says number 1869 there. For people that don't know, what is that?
I believe that would be the serial number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what collectors, especially Dr. Murphy, would be looking for guns with matching serial numbers on them when possible. That would mean that the gun was the same. You can find matching serial numbers. It's kind of like matching serial numbers on a car. Whenever you want to have an older antique car, my father's a big antique car enthusiast. matching numbers, that's what you want, and you want these on your guns as well.
Just to be clear, matching what to what? Could you explain that?
You would have the matching gun parts. So you would have sometimes the serial numbers, which would come on the end or the breech of the gun. Sometimes you would find them, depending on the manufacturer, you could find serial numbers on the butt plate, which is much more rare. You would also find it on the lock of the gun. So you would want to have the same lock, the same barrel, the lock, stock, and barrel, the old way of saying it. That's one fun way of putting it. But that's what you would look for on the guns if they had more than one number on them.
All right, so then this next one, I think we've left New Orleans and headed to Atlanta, Georgia. And yeah, so this one is a 1863 model. Does the lock have the same, lock plate have the same features?
It has the flag. I can't see it as close up. There we go. Athens, Georgia. It just looks a tiny bit different in writing, in stamping.
When we move from 1861 and 2 to 63 and 64, we have different ramrod styles.
It's got the grooved end. This is smooth. So it's tulip style. I don't know how this would work too.
Yeah, so we have, this is more, you know, if you're more of the common collector, you're going to see these on Enfields most likely. That's what the Enfield style looks more like. And then, as John pointed out, this is a tulipped. Tulipped is looks closer to the Springfield model, the U.S. Springfield model that you would see, just to kind of give you some common ground. Now, John, we have 4 beautiful pieces here. You know, and Dr. Murphy's collected a lot through the years. You know, you mentioned that he's an award-winning collector, and I can see why. These are an amazing, just one very small portion of his collection. Can you tell us a little bit about the awards that he won over the years?
Yeah, I think, well, this takes us back to the his membership in the American Society of Arms Collectors, which is a fairly prestigious group of collectors that, you know, focus on all kinds of different materials, not just Civil War. And so they meet twice a year, and he was active for 30 plus years in this organization. And what you can see in front of me are some of the medals and some of the awards that he won at different times. You know, they would meet, the group would come together. I think there were 100 members, and they usually met in a different city. And they would have their annual meeting, and then they would set up displays. And the different members would, you know, show off basically what they had acquired, and like an exhibit, really, putting a little museum exhibit together. And so he was, you know, as I said, you know, received a number of different awards. He was extremely proud of his collection, and I think as he acquired enough pieces, he would, you know, do different kind of thematic displays around carbines or around different makers, for example, and things of that nature. So yes, he was very active, and he was acknowledged as a serious collector by a number of these awards. So thank you for bringing that up.
Before we started filming, if you could just kind of go back to what we were talking about a little bit about, how did Greensboro end up with the collection? You know, I know he's very proud of it, and you mentioned he wanted to keep the collection together. So I was just curious, in a nutshell, you know, how did the arms collection come here to Greensboro?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's like a lot of things, a little bit of serendipity and timing and who you know, right? So Dr. Murphy was in Greensboro visiting with some friends who were also arms collectors, and at that time was introduced to the director of the museum, Bill Moore. And so Dr. Murphy, you know, created a friendship, relationship with the museum director. And when Murphy got to the point where he was seriously wanting to identify a place where his collection could go for the long term, you know, I think that the museum was one of the several places he had in mind. And then again, because he wanted his collection to stay together and all of it to be at the same place, you know, a lot of museums, other institutions were not willing to do that, and this one was. So those are some of the reasons, and some of the, you know, concisely how it is that the collector from Southern California, how his collection ended up in Greensboro, North Carolina.
That's fantastic. Gary, if you could just walk down here just for 1 minute. We're about to switch out to yet another collection, or piece of the collection. I just wanted to show the muzzles of these guns, and you can see again, the different ramrods. We're going to see the changing of our sights. We're going to start to see our sights start to change. We're going to start to probably run out of brass, so they're not going to be using it as much on the end sight that you would see here. And again, I'm not touching any of this, don't worry. So what you're looking at is just absolutely a beautiful collection of Confederate arms who are trying to make the best of a bad situation manufacturing, in a manufacturing sense, because they've now been ousted from New Orleans in April of 1862. Now they have to move on to Georgia, and over time, you know, the resources will start to dwindle. And so that's what we're starting to see with this collection. So it's interesting to look at that these pieces, these museum pieces, tell us a story. They're speaking to us without actually speaking to us. So we're going to take another look at the Murphy Arms collection here at the Greensboro History Museum. We'll be right back. So John, we've pulled out some new pieces from the collection. We have 4 more pieces of Confederate arms. These are carbines. What's a carbine, and you know, who manufactured these ones that we are looking at here?
Okay, good questions. These pieces are again manufactured by Cook and Brother, and to the question of carbine. So a carbine is a rifle essentially that's a shorter version, and those were especially important for men on horseback, much easier to handle, much less unwieldy, but basically it's a short version of a rifle.
Mm-hmm. So to make it easier to wield on horseback, what we're looking at here is again what evolution from 61, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, correct.
So as we start to take a look here, we have a few different versions. What I'm noticing different on these, obviously they're shorter. On the reverse side, there's a reverse, and I don't want to touch these. Could you flip one of these,
sure.
John, for us?
Yeah.
So I'm noticing that we have a hanger here for the horseback, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're riding on a horseback, you want to fire this gun and you want to pull out another one, you can actually hook a sling to it and you can drop the gun and it'll start to bang off the side of you or the horse. It'll be a little annoying after time, but it does give you the opportunity to pull out another weapon if you need to, say a sword, pistol, another carbine. The other thing that I'm noticing, which is interesting, is the ramrods that we have here. How would these ramrods function here, John?
Well, I think the innovation with these, especially the 62 and 63, is that they're made in such a way that it minimizes the chance of the person who's loading the weapon from from losing it. So it would slide down like this and then go inside there. And you see this innovation on a couple of different rifles and carbines for other makers. But just if you lose your ramrod, you're not in business anymore, right? So anything to help the soldier, minimize his potential losses and be effective in his execution of, shooting weapon, ammunition, etc. So
I noticed that we have on 63 here, we have that very innovative ramrod. We don't have that innovation here in 1864. We also, on this one, and this could just have changed over time, but we also don't have the area where you could put that sling onto it. So it looks like almost we may be running out of the parts that we need or the raw materials. It's speculation probably. But John, these are fantastic pieces here. Could you stand one up for us just so we can kind of get the idea of the height on it?
Yeah, you can see compared to the other one we looked at, it's considerably shorter.
Yeah.
And obviously it's much lighter in weight as well.
Yeah, and you can effectively hit someone with, depending on what carbine, at about 300 yards. These are not repeating rifles. There are differences between carbines, muskets, rifles, rifled muskets, and repeaters. These are single shot muzzle loading, meaning that you load it from the business end of this gun down to the breech. You're not seeing any breech loaders, which would be a load from the rear or the breech of the gun, the back of the gun. So you're not seeing that here. So these are a great piece of the collection. Now, John has promised us some local Greensboro connections, so we're going to take a look at those, swap these guns out for more really awesome artifacts behind the scenes at the Greensboro History Museum. Check out their website and be sure to come here in person when you're in the Triad area. What we're looking at now, John, looks like some local arms. Can you walk us through what we're looking at here from the collection?
Yeah, so I've pulled examples of Piedmont-made rifles. These are all pieces that were made in Guilford County or neighboring counties, and many of them were, well, they're interesting. Each has their own story, but several of them, in fact, were originally makers of hunting and sporting rifles, and also associated with Quakers. There's a large Quaker population that settled in Guilford County and Greensboro, and they were, very much pacifist during the war. So, but I'll talk about that as well as we go through these pieces. So we've got 5 different examples of Piedmont rifles that were made during the Civil War. The first one is a piece that is manufactured by Mendenhall, Jones, and Gardner. I don't know if you're familiar with that name. Mendenhall stands for Cyrus P. Mendenhall, and he was a well-respected businessman and actually was also the mayor of Greensboro at a time. So he and these 2 other gentlemen pooled their resources to manufacture this weapon. So I believe this one's stamped with their initials, North Carolina, and I'm not sure what else you can make out. Could you make out a date and above the SC or?
1863.
Okay.
It looks like CS to me.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. So this has got, as you pointed out on the other rifles, this is also a muzzle loader with a ramrod and markings on the lock. It's got the 2 brass bands.
So I noticed at one point it had the attachment where you could attach the side bayonet. It looks like it had been broken off, which is easy enough to do with these.
How they were attached.
Yeah, exactly. And if you did stack arms, if you had the ability to stack arms, whenever you make them look like a teepee in the pictures, it's very easy to snap your sights. Any reenactor knows if you have to trust someone with your next gun to put that into the stack and you interlock them, it's an easy way to snap off either your sight or that side piece. I also noticed on all of these guns, except for the top carbine, the very rudimentary either rifling or the rudimentary difference in the ramrods. It almost looks like someone took a bolt or a nut and put on the end of this first one. As we move up the line, these are more indicative of ramrods that would be used in a smooth bore. Very, again, rudimentary. We almost have the rifling on this gun, which might be a little bit hard to see. It almost looks like it's hexagonal, and same up on this end. So it's interesting to see that these locally made guns, they're doing the best with what they have. What else do we have here?
Okay, so then moving away from the Mendenhall, Jones, and Gardner, we have a rifle made by H.C. Lamb and Co. And this is another piece that was made. Lamb family was in the, I believe, was in the rifle manufacturing business for some time. I believe they're out of High Point, and I'm not sure if there are any markings visible on the lock plate or not. Let me get that out of your way. Are you able to?
Not that I see.
Okay.
And the markings on the lock plate are important to the government at the time. We talked earlier about serial numbers. This is every gun that's handed out is actually owned by the Confederate or the United States government. So whenever you hand it out to a soldier, they're going to mark down in a ledger, usually in triplicate, who has that gun. And sometimes, when you're very lucky, you might be able to be a collector, purchase one of those guns, and then actually figure out what soldier carried that weapon throughout the American Civil War. We've seen some of that in earlier videos when we visited Gettysburg National Military Park, so check out some of our videos with their behind-the-scene collection with Berdan sharpshooters.
Good.
Okay, and then this next piece we're moving on to, this is an example of a Clap Gates and Company rifle. And again, I don't think that there's anything on the block plate either that would tell us.
No, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, the grain on
very...
a lot of these stocks are just absolutely beautiful, and the finish.
And this is not brass, unlike the first 2, right? This butt plate looks like it's iron.
It looks like it's iron. It looks like they're making do with what they have. It's also interesting that you have this kind of semi-rounded rear breech here, and then it gives way to the actual rest of the barrel. I have seen, at least in smaller guns, where they've actually, you could unscrew, it's very rare, these are usually homemade things, where you can actually unscrew the barrel. It looks like this is actually all one piece, but that is something that you do see. Sometimes that's prevalent in pistols.
Yeah, and I think that's also true for the Lamb. It's I don't know if it's octagonal, but it's right. Isn't that similar? Although
Very
it extends a little bit further down the barrel.
Now I'm most excited for this last one. This is the one that I have been waiting for since John pulled this from the Greensboro History Museum collection.
What is it? Let's not unveil it yet. Let's talk about it for a sec.
Okay, so yeah, so our last piece will be a piece that actually has ties to Greensboro. Not many of these were made. It's a carbine as opposed to the rifle. So again, that's a shorter version of the rifle, typically used by men on horseback. And it is Jeremiah Tarpley, or Tarpley Garrett and Company, applied for and was awarded a Confederate patent, which is kind of unusual as opposed to the U.S. patents. Many of these weapons, Morse and lots of others, were recipients of patents by the U.S. government. But so Tarpley came up with this rather unusual, kind of peculiar, definitely an eye-catcher kind of design that's missing some of the more traditional elements, like a forestock. But it's also in a way rather innovative because it's the first breech loader that we're seeing today of all the pieces that we've looked at so far.
Yeah, so a breech loader is a gun that can be loaded at the back of the gun, also known as the breech. You see John is exposing the area where you can place your cartridge in there. And this looks like it would have been a brass cartridge. This could take a brass cartridge, correct?
I believe that's correct, yeah.
Yeah, this is interesting that he points out that there's no forestock. What is the forestock? That is actually this piece of wood that runs underneath the barrel. You might not think that's important, but if you've never shot a gun before, you're dealing with explosives and you're dealing with flame. So the more you fire these things, the hotter metal gets with fire. So without a forestock on it, you better have a glove, or you better figure out, you could wrap a sling around it, because this barrel is going to get real hot and you're going to burn your hand very fast. This one may or may not have, seeing here now, looking a little bit more closely, it almost looks like it could take a percussion cap, and it could
I think it did, yeah.
And it could take kind of like a Sharps, a paper cartridge, putting in the rear there. But this is not a repeating rifle. You're not going to load this thing and fire 14 rounds. This is a one-shot deal, reload every time. And it's also interesting here on the breech, where just how wide, here we are in the breech. It's showing 1863. It's very well stamped.
Yeah, so that's the patent I was referring to earlier from the Confederate government. And this one, you can see, we were talking earlier about serial numbers. So this one is stamped in multiple locations with the same number, which would tell you that that is the serial number, that all of these pieces are, original to it and assigned to it, as opposed to being replaced later or something of that nature. So just wanted to, so here it again, the number appears. I'm sure if we look closely, we would see at other locations as well. So again, this is a carbine, so it would have been had this on the attachment on the back, so you could wear it around your shoulder or whatever, so as not to worry about dropping it or reloading it.
Fantastic.
I have been involved with this collecting since I was a kid. My father and mother, they collect a lot. I have never seen that type of gun up close. I've only seen it in the books. So John, we really appreciate you bringing that out, mainly to show me, but also to show our viewers on our channel. So again, you can come out to the Greensboro History Museum. We're going to explore a little bit more of it, because we're seeing behind the scenes, but there are these guns on display as well through the Murphy collection. Hey everybody, we're back at the Greensboro History Museum, and we've actually moved into the public side of the Greensboro History Museum here in Greensboro, North Carolina, and we're going to take a look at the temporary display right now, the John and Isabella Murphy Confederate long arms collection that they have here at the museum. They're currently refurbishing the exhibit. You've seen behind the scenes. Now we're going to see what's on display here. John, I'm going to take Gary right over to you. I'm noticing we have just a wall of awesome Confederate arms. We start with muskets, moving down to carbines. We have smooth bores where you can see the different ends of the smooth bore for the third band versus the third band at the top. Pretty neat thing. So you wanted to talk specifically about the Morse carbine. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. I'll just back up in a second and say, so this is not a temporary display. This is our permanent display, but it is in a work in transition. So the first section, we're going to talk about some of the technology and some of the design innovations, and that's why I thought it would be important to talk about Morse as we have several of these pieces. People may or may not realize Morse was quite an innovator and applied for many patents, wasn't terribly successful financially, but introduced a lot of ideas and technology that was very important in terms of future developments, later developments. And so what we have on display here is one of his breech loaders. And again, we're talking about the breech loader as a piece that's loaded here rather than at the end of the muzzle, or the barrel, excuse me. And in addition to the Morse, and so I wanted, this is open because I wanted people to see how this would be raised up and loaded, and then you would close this before firing it. And in addition to the Morse carbine, we also have, which is really unusual, is an example of his centerfire metallic cartridge that was used in this specific weapon. So we've got the Morse carbine, the ammunition, the cartridge, and then also a brass bullet mold that would have been used to melt the lead to shape that. So there are a couple of different breech loading pieces in here. Here's the Tarpley again that we saw earlier, and then you can see other examples of Sharps and SC Robinson where pieces are raised and lowered in order to insert the ammunition.
So what you're seeing is, as John pointed out, these are innovative. This is the evolution of arms to what we see coming up here today, where these again are not multi-fire carbines. We're not going to be putting in 7 bullets to any of these and just starting to fire like we think of today with semi-automatic weapons. These will be single shot, so every time you're going to have to reload it, and that is going to force you to take aim another time, which is actually an interesting concept because most people think fire superiority, just keep firing down range. But during World War II, the Americans talk about using their M1 carbines where they can fire 8 shots. All you have to do is pull the trigger as fast as you can. The Germans pointed out who were using carbines of themselves, Mausers for instance, which were lever action, which were bolt action, and they would have to eject a bullet, put a new one in every time and re-aim. They said that they thought they had better accuracy because they had to re-aim every time rather than the Americans who had fire superiority, just firing down range. So that is actually something to take into consideration when you start thinking about these arms. John, what else do we have here in the collection? So we're going to be talking about stories.
Yeah.
Move our way down the wall.
Yeah, so the second section is really about individuals' personal connections to specific weapons. So starting at the top, you see a blank stock, and then below that you see a completed weapon. What's interesting about this piece is that we are fairly certain we know the individual who carved these stocks, and this was an African American who was a slave, whose name was William Finley, and he worked for Dixon, Nelson and Company, the maker of the weapons, and in fact still has relatives that are still around. I think it's great grandchildren at this point who we were able to get in contact with and verify some of this information. But so we really wanted to show, this is the raw, crudely shaped stock that then becomes this part of the weapon, the barrel and the stock together, and the story of the African American from Alabama who created these pieces or worked to shape the stocks for a number of pieces for the Dixon, Nelson and Company. The next one we have down here is Morse, and we talked about him a little bit earlier. And then below that is, again, this is a Morse carbine, but what's interesting about this is the story, and it's incredibly hard to read, but this is finely engraved into this brass part of the weapon here. And I've made a transcription which I'll read because it's impossible to read it, even in this blown up photo reproduction. It says March 1, 1865. Company is K, G and K, Massachusetts Infantry, by a night march surprised near St. Stephen, South Carolina, a squad of Georgia cavalry who had followed Sherman's army from Chattanooga to Savannah. This carbine was captured in the fight by Captain Charles C. Sewell. And here's a photograph of Sewell, and a little bit of, so he was a Harvard graduate, he survived the war, obviously, but so a number of pieces that were Confederate made were captured by Union soldiers and taken as war souvenirs. Some of them have plaques on them, some of them have engravings. I would say that's a relatively small percentage of the collection, of the Murphy collection, but some of the most interesting stories are those that are literally attached to the piece, so you can then go back and do further research and learn about that individual and verify their story or learn more about what happened to that person after the war. So, so that's the story with Charles Sewell.
It's interesting in here, John, we were talking about, the evolution of this display, which I was incorrect, I'm sorry, this is their permanent display in here. What we're seeing here is, the differences in the views of the weapons. Some of us look at it from a technological standpoint. Some of us look at it from the human standpoint, some from a geographic standpoint. So it's interesting how one piece can tell the larger story of either an individual, of perhaps an armory, or even a regiment, depending on who is armed with what type of weapon. So I really appreciate you, John, opening up these cases for us here at the Greensboro History Museum. And it's not just weapons. If you're not into weapons, you can come down here and learn about Dolly Madison. They have an awesome display over here. You can learn more about Greensboro's history, which is a long history from 1808 all the way up through today. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse took place in 1781 at the edge of Greensboro, the city of Greensboro. So you can learn more about that as well. So John, we really thank you for opening up these cases here and sharing your stories at the Greensboro History Museum.
My pleasure to do it.